Great. I'm Jeff Trexler. I'm an attorney and also the interim director of the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund, which is a nonprofit organization dedicated to protecting the legal rights of the comic arts and the comics community. The Comic Book Legal Defense Fund started in the mid-1980s when a manager at a comic shop was arrested and convicted for selling comics that are now considered to be classics, like Heavy Metal, works by Richard Corbin, Omaha Cat Dancer, published by Kitchen Sink Press and Dennis Kitchen. These works now, they sell for a lot of money. They're recognized as as modern classics. But back then, there was a police officer in Illinois, of all places, that considered these to be obscene. And so the manager was arrested, brought to the local court, convicted, and people from the comics community, with Dennis Kitchen at the center of it, raised funds to support an appeal. And ultimately, the conviction was overturned. One of the things we've done in our convention appearances is we've had, a museum of censorship. A number of them were cases that we've represented people, whether they're creators or stores. For example, you may have heard about my defense of genderqueer by Maya Kobabe. A couple years ago, in the state of Virginia, a person who was running for Congress decided to take advantage of the culture wars and try to have genderqueer, graphic novel by Maya Kobabe, declared obscene and prohibited to sell throughout the entire state of Virginia. One of the interesting things about my position was I'm an attorney, as I've mentioned, in addition to being the interim director of the organization, which enabled us for the first time in our history, not simply to raise money to represent a client, a creator, a retailer, a publisher, whoever, but actually I was able to personally represent Maya Kobabe in court and defend against this petition, which we won. We actually had the law that was used to try to censor the book declared unconstitutional. The great resurgence of comic censorship, most people think of it in terms of schools and libraries, but it has far-reaching impact in the comics community. One is, of course, on creators. One of the questions we get a lot is, all right, I write LGBTQ material, I write material about race. Is it going to get censored? Do I need to hold back? Are there things I can't say? Are there things I can't draw? And so there's been a real chilling effect among creators who are worried that if they write about these themes, they draw these themes, that their books not be picked up by a publisher or by a distributor. We also have a resurgence of arrests or threats of arrests. So one story that really hit home for me, we heard from a retailer who was told that they were going to face trial for distributing a book that had an LGBTQ character, LGBTQ themes. That was considered to be harmful to minors. There are people who believe that even if they don't show the sexual act, that because it's illegal to have for kids to have sex under the age of 16, 17, 18, whatever the age of consent is, that any material that talks about sexual identity or anything having to do with sex is pornography to those kids and illegal to sell. So this retailer was threatened. The police had come. They said charges were going to be filed. It had been referred to the district attorney. And what we had to do was actually talk to the district attorney and persuade them that it's a losing case, serious First Amendment implications, persuade them not to file charges. But again, it's a real chilling effect on the retailer. These shops are open. They're filled with material today about representation, people with all sorts of backgrounds talking about all sorts of issues. But if they face arrest, it's a real danger to them. And it's also a danger to retailers, distributors, and publishers who sell books to schools. Comic shops are a community center. Kids come, they play games. Kids come, they see books. A lot of teenagers come, a lot of college students come. And there's books for all ages here. There's lots of different things. But they are a place, particularly if you're an outsider, where, just as it was for me when I was a kid, it's a place you can go and you can feel comfortable and you can feel safe. Well, now we have efforts, like in Texas, to force ratings on books that have anything to do with gender identity or sexual expression. They would have to be categorized as sexually explicit or sexually relevant. So imagine if every book with an LGBTQ theme that could have the potential to end up in a school, whether by the comic shop selling it or it showing up in a reading group or somebody buying it and then donating it to the school. Imagine if every book that talked about LGBTQ themes had to have the word sexually relevant or sexually explicit on the cover. It's like putting XXX on every book that's relevant to that community. So we're fighting against that rating system in Texas. There are other states like Missouri and Iowa, where they talk about making sure that material is age appropriate. And so if a comic shop, again, works with a local school for a reading group or a comic club, which is popular around the country, depending on what's in the shop, you could have a situation where the retailer, the teacher gets arrested for having certain books in a shop where kids frequent. 2018, 2019, we thought we were past it, and it just actually turned out to be a moment of rest for the resurgence of the same kind of persecution, the same threat to free expression through the comic arts that we saw when comics were in newsstands in the 1950s and when comic shops really hit the mainstream in the 80s and 90s. You know, I remember early on when I was attending one New York Comic Con, and I observed to a friend after the first few conventions, I said, wow, this is like one of the first Comic Cons I've gone to where I don't know most of the people. And that is an amazing thing. It was a lot of young people, clearly from all over the city in New Jersey and Connecticut, all different backgrounds, all different interests. Comics were changing not just as a medium with more people doing it, but as a culture. And then the pandemic happens. And there were a couple things going on with the pandemic that got people. One, parents could see what their kids were reading because school shifted to the home. And parents were seeing that kids were getting assignments and having books to read. And a number of these were graphic novels and manga in their English classes, and even people use manga and comics to teach math and science, and lots of nonfiction and interesting fictional graphic novels where you can explore all sorts of themes. And so we started seeing in 2021, 2022, early 2022, these cases where parents were saying, reminiscent of the 1950s, to get back to your earlier question, kids aren't going to be literate if they are reading these graphic novels. The graphic novels have pictures. They're not tested on pictures. That's not going to teach them to read. If they read graphic novels, they're not going to be able to face modern society. They're not going to be able to survive. So part of what we did there was talk about how words and pictures are how we communicate today. A kid understands comics. They understand how to storyboard not just video. They understand how to do a PowerPoint. They understand how to read infographics. They understand how to engage 21st century culture the way 21st culture is communicating. A kid who just reads text is going to be way behind. They're not going to understand what is being said through images. And that was evident by the way a number of parents and teachers were, and administrators more than teachers to be honest, were interpreting the comics themselves. It was clear that they couldn't read these comics. They didn't know what they were saying. They didn't understand their significance. They even got things like the ages of characters wrong. Like in Genderqueer, I had to counter claims that this book was filled with child porn and young teens and preteens having sex, when none of that happens in the book. So we had that challenge. And the other one was there was a change in norms. America itself had changed and over the past 60 years, but really over the past 20 years, some interesting things happened. One, we had a growing sense of our racial consciousness and our understanding that it went beyond, that race was not something that happened when you had a few bigots over there doing it, but that there were some systemic issues and some recurring issues that you could change some things superficially, but there are other things that needed to be addressed, and it had some long-standing ramifications throughout American culture. But we also had the rise of acceptance legally of the LGBTQ community. And so when I was in law school 30 years ago, the Supreme Court had just said, in a famous case called Bowers against Hardwick, that you could throw people in jail for being gay. If states could pass what were called anti-sodomy laws, and if you had sex with somebody or some kind of sexual act with somebody of the same sex, it was lawful and constitutional to imprison them, to find them guilty of a criminal act and imprison them. That was overturned roughly 20 years ago, about 20 years ago, in a case, Lawrence against Texas, that overturned that earlier decision. And that launched a series of cases that recognized you could have gays in the military, you could have gay marriage. And what was significant, it wasn't like earlier cases where there was a sense that you're protecting a right to privacy, i.e. people can do whatever they want in the bedroom and it's protected. But it was that people who were gay, lesbian, non-binary, whatever sort of falls in that continuum, they were protected because they were citizens like everybody else. It was equal protection, equal rights. And so we just had, actually, during around the time of the pandemic, the Supreme Court recognizing that you could protect, a civil rights law protects gender identity. Civil rights law protects same-sex expression even in the workplace, and so you can't fire somebody for their sexuality. So we've had this radical shift, and one of the great things about comics, one of the great things about our American educational system where they converged is that if you say that somebody is a citizen and somebody has rights, we want to express ourselves and we want to teach it. It's like civics, right? If we're saying that LGBTQ people have rights, we're going to teach that in school. If you say that racism is an issue, we're going to talk about that in school and kids are going to address it. And so that's another thing that parents saw. Teachers and librarians were bringing in books that were talking about the LGBTQ experience. They were talking about what it means. They portrayed people with these backgrounds as regular, ordinary citizens in day-to-day life, not some special thing that needed to be hidden or not talked about until you were 18. And kids and parents saw these graphic novels in their schools, and a number of them just went ballistic. Not every parent, it tends to be a very small number in the community, but they went ballistic. And so we had the situation where we were fighting CBLDF. We were countering some challenges in Texas where the school board was discussing the challenges online. And I used to joke before things changed that one of the reasons why people would not want my job is that I had to sit through hours and hours of school board meetings, right? Because it was just usually people talking and both sides would argue and nothing would be settled. And then there'd be like 3 hours talking about millage and taxation, which is really, really not exciting. Sometimes you had to go through that to get to the good stuff. But a parent in Virginia, Fairfax, Virginia, said, hey, during the pandemic, if they're broadcasting these meetings on YouTube, YouTube's a visual medium. So they took genderqueer and they held up pages from genderqueer to the camera, to the school board and to the camera. And then those pages and that scene, they were posted on Twitter. And that went viral. And again, during the pandemic, when everybody's like, most people are stuck at home or they're afraid to go out, they feel like they have no agency in life because everything's been shut down. All of a sudden, showing pages from comic books on the screen became a way to become internet famous very, very quickly. And so we had people in New York, in fact, the town where I live outside New York City, had a big issue with genderqueer. Again, coast to coast. Connecticut, we've had multiple cases in Connecticut. And it wasn't just genderqueer. They started hitting all sorts of graphic novels with LGBTQ and racial themes. Missouri, Iowa, Arkansas, Texas, Washington, California. I mean, we've handled cases like all across the country. People were raising concerns about books and trying to get them banned. A number of them focused not just on the content itself, but on the fact that these were graphic novels, and that graphic novels were more dangerous than the same scenes, the same content in words, because you could see them. They had a lot more information, they were more vivid, and thus they had a greater potential to damage kids' mental health. So one of the things that Maya Kobabe said to me after E1 was that the great thing about comics is they give people the ability to show themselves as they would like to be seen. Comics have the sense of infinite possibility for everybody. Everybody can express themselves through comics, and comics is a place where everybody can be seen, free from all the constraints that you have in the rest of society.